Okay. Right. Well, hello everyone, and this is a fascinating event. It's going to be a fascinating event, and it's I'd like to introduce several people who are all going to be talking today. I'm just chairing, you'd be glad to know, so not too much from me. First we have Stephan Loewentheil, who gives his name, eponymously of course, to the collection, the China photography collection, the Lowenthal Collection. And he is, well, originally you were going to be a lawyer, weren't you, Stephan? But soon gave that up to go into a different field altogether. And he started as an antiquarian book dealer and formed the 19th century rare book and photograph shop and its subsidiary luxury catalogues. And I believe that these, the manuscripts and books that have gone through your hands have gone under into universities worldwide, into major museum collections, into the White House, and a very comprehensive representation there. And I know that apart from your fascination with China photography is also that of the early Western American landscapes, and also Matthew Brady and the Civil War collection, which of course is this historical record just at that time that photography is becoming more widespread. So your personal collection, Stephan, of early China photographs is really the biggest in the world. I know you've got around about 20,000 works in the collection, and you've exhibited in museums and libraries in the States, in China as well, and that you really are passionate about not only your collection and the historic and aesthetic interest it gives you, but also about sharing it around, that this incredible resource is hugely important. And also we have talking today Stacey Lambrow. Now you are the curator, Stacey, aren't you, of the collection? And there's all, despite the fact that you started, you know, with the idea that you're going to be a librarian, you soon realized that you preferred the relative cut and thrust of the antiquarian book world in the commercial field, and then got absolutely brought into the photography collection, and you've just learned by doing the job, in my opinion, the best way of learning altogether. And you're going to be talking to us about the collection as well, and some of those early photographs from, you know, Beijing and Shanghai, and the American landscape tradition, of course, is a great interest of yours. And last but not least, we have Stephanie Tung, and Stephanie is a specialist in the history of photography based at the Peabody Essex Museum. She has co-curated Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China, which is an exhibition of 19th century photography, and I believe you've co-curated that with Karina Corrigan of the collections in the H.A. Crosby Ford's Curator of Asian Export Art. And you're also just completing your PhD at Princeton, which I'm sure is exhausting, but ultimately very satisfying. And with your research interests in global exchange, transnational art exchange, modernism, translation studies, and the way that artistic labor is perceived, that you're embodying as this sort of really cross-field analysis that is so important to academic study now. I'm Viv Laws. I run education programs for LACA, the London Asian and African Contemporary Art, which is a program of events, if you like, pop-up events, talks, panels and so on, to bring contemporary Asian and African art really to London, which, despite being a world centre for international art, is lagging behind, or has historically lagged behind, and LACA is there to try and fill that gap. And enough talking from me. I would like at this point to introduce Stephan and to put up your fantastic images, Stephan, here. So I shall just share my screen and get the images up so that we can see them, and I hope that's all clear to everyone. And I mean, initially, the first thing I want to do is to get, Stephan, you talking about your collection and how it all began, where these 20,000 objects, my goodness, that is some collection. So where did it all and when did it all begin for you?
Well, when I was an undergraduate at university for my senior project, I went to the United Nations to see China become a full member in the United Nations. And that began my interest in China. Then years later, I became aware of the happy coincidence that the emergence of paper replicable photography was occurring at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, when the world was changing physically in many ways. And I determined that it would be an interesting collection to take a few areas and see and document how the world had existed as documented in photography. As I began that process, China became a major source of my inspiration, because China has such a long and great history that it was important that it be recorded. Through historical anomalies, there was very little collecting of photography in China, and most or much of the great Chinese photography had left the country with visitors in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it struck me as a worthy concept to put together a comprehensive collection, both of the historic photography and the great art photography that had been created in China in the early days of paper photography. So that's how it happened.
That's how it began. And this is, we're talking somewhat sort of roughly 3 decades ago, thereabouts here, that this project started. Now, you've mentioned two words which caught my attention. So you've talked about the historic nature of photography, the way it documents certain periods or certain themes and areas, and you also mentioned the artistic importance of photography. Now, to what extent do those two characteristics, to what extent is it important that they're there in the same object, that they come together, or do you think there is also a place perhaps for something which is really a history, and that artistic merit is not necessarily there, but it's important to tell a history, or purely aesthetic? How do you look at photography?
Well, in the early traditions of collecting photography, they were often considered distinct, where there were the art photography collections in the major museums of the world, and there were historic collections often in universities or institutions. But it occurred to me that given the fact that photographers in the 19th century had to use cumbersome glass plates and dangerous chemicals, that they were very serious about the images that they chose. And very often they had fabulous eyes because they had to take these things correctly the first time. Yeah. So it became obvious to me that many photographs that were taken that one might consider historic, architectural, or of nature really were true masterpieces and deserved a place next to all the other great historic photographers in other places. So when I built my collection, we tried to get the greatest artistic photographs by people who had been in China, or often those who were native Chinese people who became great photographers. And very often we found that there was an overlap between the two, where great photographers took pictures of important places and thus created images that were both artistic and historical. I mentioned that also that this is not just me, but little places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in recent years had a show of Civil War photography, which had traditionally been considered historic, but the curators there put together an artistic show showing great photography that was both important artistically and historically. So I think the trend now is to see great photography in a very broad sense. It is both historic, certainly by definition, but it is also a very high art. And 19th century photography, because of the difficulty of production, remains among the most prized of these artistic productions.
Yeah, and you can see it. I think it's become unfashionable a little to sort of to denigrate the craft of artistic production, and indeed in painting and sculpture, the more traditional media. But I mean, the actual technical capacity, the organization it takes to work with glass plates, and then create albumin prints. I mean, we can see it, can't we, in this work by John Thompson, this hanging temple in Fujian. And the first thing I thought when I saw it was, it's almost life imitating art. If anyone who knows the great Chinese ink and brush painting tradition, the scholar tradition, of creating, of allowing the chi, the spirit of the landscape, to kind of work through the artist as a conduit, the literati figure, this extremely elite high art. And we're presented with, the Northern Sung, ink and brush paintings, these majestic peaks. And then you see a photograph like this and you think, it's almost the real landscape, the real buildings almost seem to be like these incredible painterly expressive forms. What is it about this that you think makes it a great work?
It's very clear that this photograph is a great artistic achievement. I mean, the difficulty in capturing the historic temple, to bring in all the cultural and architectural detail of the Chinese genius that created this in this difficult spot, using a glass plate without the ability to use artificial lighting. It's really an extraordinary artistic and historical achievement. And Thompson, who was a very great photographer, became beloved of Chinese scenery and created pictures that are truly amazing. And this is one of my favorites. But anyone who wants to understand why we say it is neither history nor art, but both, this is a prime example.
Yeah, I mean, it is a stunning piece. And I mean, this early photography, I think the characteristics that we see with the selection of works that we have today is this beauty. I mean, you can see another Thompson work here with the pagoda on its own island in Fujian. And again, it's got that ethereal, poetic quality, and it's a China that is defined by works like this, is defined by ink painting traditions and poetry. I mean, do you think that this is a China that still exists?
Well, I think when you look at a photograph like this, there are a few things worth mentioning. First of all, he was one of the first Westerners to travel inside China and do photography. And this is a picture that merits study and reflection, because again, it represents much of the Chinese philosophy, much of Chinese art, and done in this new, at that point, technique of photography. The other thing to realize about this is in these days, prints were not created in great numbers. In fact, this was part of a book that had a very limited production run of individual actual photos that were then put into a portfolio for the book. And right now, there are about 9 or 10 of these that exist of the entire collection. So these are very rare cultural artifacts indeed. And I think it's important to recognize them as important cultural artifacts of China, even though they were created by a Western photographer.
Yeah,
and I think that's we will get to wonderful pictures taken by great Chinese photographers, many of whom surpass their Western counterparts in many ways. But this is interesting because it does show an appreciation for Chinese aesthetics that appears in some of the early great Western photographers' work.
And actually, indeed, the fact that this is by a Westerner, and you've already said that there's a lot of the photographs that you've collected, a lot of them had come, they'd left China, they'd gone with missionaries and politicians and soldiers and so on. But how do Chinese collectors now, or even Chinese cultural commentators, how are they responding to these collections, which in some cases show a China that doesn't exist any longer, or not in this way, not without the,
in general, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on how Chinese intellectuals feel, but I can cite that we work with Tsinghua University, a very great university, in their new museum, and we had a wonderful experience putting on an exhibition in Beijing. We had tens of thousands of visitors. We had panels of great Chinese photographers and Chinese historians. So I can speak at the present time, there's a great appreciation growing for the early photography, which represents both the early period of photography in China, but also represents the cultural and aesthetic and artistic tradition upon which modern China was built. And I think there's a growing interest in China among these. We've also had interaction with the cultural attaché from China to America, who has expressed great interest in this genre of photography. So I would say, as in most art, modernism grows from the history of the past, and it's very important. Now, as you mentioned, most of these photographs had emigrated from China early on for historic anomalies. Not many of them were saved in China. There were no photography museums early on, and not many collectors, and many of them were destroyed or lost. So that vast majority, 99% of my collection or more, was accumulated from outside of China. And the idea of making them available to China is very important to me, which is why we enjoyed so much doing the exhibition in Beijing. And hopefully in the future, we will be able to find a way to bring much of this photography back to the Chinese people, who will be deeply fascinated by it.
Yes, it's a cultural return, much like the sort of many of the art pieces and artifacts, you know, that we've seen over the last 20 years with the exchange and the sort of the re-embrace of culture that we're seeing, and particularly sort of 19th century culture. And I wanted to ask you about this fantastic austere work by Felice Beato, and tell us, I know that there's a fascinating story that goes with this, and the reason he was there to start with.
Well, Beato was with an expeditionary force of Western forces who went into China, Beijing particularly in 1860, and committed serious artistic horrors in desecrating and destroying many buildings that had a long history. But Beato was there embedded with the forces and took pictures which allowed us to see many things that were later destroyed. This was not destroyed. The North Gate shows you the grandeur and strength of China at the moment Westerners first came in force. And he took pictures throughout the journey of the expeditionary forces. And some of them are well known, some of them are lesser known. Our collection has a complete original volume with his annotations in them of the pictures that he took. And it's very interesting because it really represents the first Western artistic perspective on the great culture of China, specifically Beijing, at this moment.
Yeah.
Interesting also is this is two photographs put together as a panorama. And given the scope of many of the great Chinese architectural works, later we'll see pictures of the Great Wall. It's hard to get any perspective on them without this panoramic process, which was being adopted simultaneously around the world in Western America and in China as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really gets across the whole construction of the work, that sort of forbidding nature of that's true of any sort of protective edifice of this type. And Felice, I mean, Beato was obviously, you know, he was absolutely one of the greats, and I find this an extraordinarily moving photograph in many ways, not only because of its aesthetic, what it's recording aesthetically, but of course this date here, 1860. this is the time at which works, you know, architectural treasures were being destroyed, weren't they?
Yes, in addition to that, there is a very strong movement in China to reconstruct many of the great historical buildings that have been lost, some just to time, some to fire, some in other adverse situations. And this collection of photographs is priceless in that regard, because throughout not just the major cities, but we have pictures of architecture that is both great and common, small towns, alleyways, great ports, great trading areas, individual temples and schools and buildings, which allow the Chinese people to replicate their great architectural heritage and their great cultural heritage in the present day. And I think that's extremely important. And when we were at Tsinghua, there was great interest in that. People were absolutely fascinated by some of the photographs of lost places and people.
Yes, I mean, and that actually illustrates perfectly, doesn't it, the role that a great collection and a comprehensive collection, importantly, plays, not only in terms of a record of a historical period or place and that artistic achievement, but actually in the conservation and in the regeneration of historic edifices, architecture and sites, you know, that would otherwise be totally lost. And it's as I say, that date, you knowing that history of China and its destruction around this period, that's a sort of moving piece that Beato has here. And if we go, I mean, this is the first of the Chinese photographers that you're showing us today, and tell us about this work and also this studio.
What we were speaking about for the moment of architectural, the Yellow Crane Tower had been destroyed by fire previously. Yeah. This is not the first. And since then, it has been destroyed and rebuilt again. So a photograph like this allows for correct reproduction of a great historical and spiritual monument, which is very, very important. This is a very famous place in Wuhan, China. In addition, it is the Yellow Crane Tower, and Pao Qi, one of the great early Chinese photographers, has taken, and I'm not a really qualified Chinese art historian, but he has placed the birds, the yellow cranes in the sky through artistic means other than photography by working the negative, which is really a very close tie to much of the Chinese painting where nature was brought to the fore, and he has recreated that ability here by putting the nature force, that is to say, the cranes of which the tower is named, into the picture. So Pao Qi was a very great photographer. His studio lasted a long time, and he is one of the early Chinese photographers whose work stands equal or superior to any of the Western photographers who are better known of the period. And I personally, I feel it necessary that this type of art be made available so that both in China and out of China, people recognize the long distinguished history of Chinese people in photography, equal in every way to people who have been better known in the West merely because of their placement in Western museums and into the canon early on. And this is one of the things that I hope my collection will help cure, is the lack of appreciation for not only the historical, but the great artistic integrity of the Chinese photographers.
Yes.
And we have very good representation. We've gone to great lengths to find representative, great photographs by a very wide range of early Chinese photographers. And I think it's a very, very important point for people to recognize that this is something, an obligation we all have, to make these early photographers take their place on the international scene.
And I mean, you bring up a really good point, which is, you know, it's now we're living through a period of change in museology, as well as academic study, and you know, the market also reflects that. But where art history, photography history, history of design is becoming pluralized, it's becoming multinational, it's having these multiple centers of production and recognizing that they're going on at the same time, and actually seeing this studio work here. And I think that detail of the cranes being added in onto the negative, that changing the manipulation of the image to fit in with an artistic tradition that is much older, you know, the painting tradition and the printmaking tradition, really brings that change home, that multiplicity that we're seeing in the art world at the moment. And I mean, a very different sort of work here. Because
one more point on that before we go ahead.
Yes.
There's one of the words that's used very often now in the museum and academics is underrepresented populations. And I have to nominate Chinese photographers as underrepresented in the museum world or the traditional teaching of art worlds. And I think it's critically important that they get the representation that they deserve, which is clear from the work itself. Anyway, that's my thought.
It's so important for things to be seen and to have that, and to have the study of it as well, you know, to have the books written and the discourse produced. And I mean, the contrast with a work such as this, where you have an extraordinary portrait with great intimacy produced here. And the Lund studio, was this a studio that specialized in portraiture, or was this just part of the production?
They did a lot of great portraiture, but they too were trying to make a living. So most photographers, although they had specialties and they worked in their specialties, they did a wider variety of things. But what I think is important about this in many ways is the cultural place of women in society is another area that is getting great study now, historically. And Pun Lee has a number of wonderful photographs, as this one is, showing a woman and a child, the family concept, and showing the dress and means of living of a wide variety of different types of people in an area where that will otherwise be lost. And I think that from a cultural standpoint, this picture represents a great portrait photograph, but also it shows us a lot about people who are not well known at a given time. This is not a wealthy woman as such, but yet she has great character and dignity in this photograph. And the interest of the child in the photographic process is something that amazes me. If you look at his eyes, it's just remarkable. He's a very precocious young man or woman. It's hard to tell. But I think that it's important to note that part of our collection is based upon bringing a wide range of peoples back into view centuries later.
Yes, I mean, he's so present. And you know, just it's occurred to me, if we take the timeline here, you know, approximately 1870, you know, this is also the period in which, I mean, if you look at the traditions of for example, French painting, where the dignity of the common person, the non-elite, is something of a trope in this sort of mid-century period, and it just really opens your mind to think, okay, so these are not isolated phenomena. This really makes it very clear. It's such an intimate portrait, and you realize that the same thing is going on through this art form of photography. And I mean, of a totally different type, and back to a Western photographer again, Thomas Child's image here of the Great Wall. I mean, arguably the most famous structure for outsiders, particularly in China.
Well, this is not only China. This is one of the greatest architectural wonders of the entire world, in the history of the world. And when Westerners came and they saw this, it was mind-blowing, to say the least. And every great photographer who was in China virtually has some image of this, bringing it to the West, where we were unaware of the scope of Chinese abilities in construction. This is an unbelievable project, and it also makes for wonderful photographs. You can see the mountains behind it. You can see the land up in front of it. And Child was an engineer by training, so his admiration for the wall went beyond just the artistic. It went to the intellectual and physical ability.
I mean, something like it puts Hadrian's Wall into perspective, wonderful as that is. And I mean, you know, and actually the role, of course, of photography, of enabling people to see what is in another place, a far-flung place that apart from the traders that are going backwards and forwards to China, you know, since the 16th century, from the West, late 16th century, actually to be able to see it, that these places, these famous structures like this actually do exist. I mean, it must have played a fundamental role in that sort of opening up of minds and appreciation of cultures, you know, far away from sort of Western centers.
Well, absolutely.
Sorry, Stephen, carry on.
No, I mean, absolutely. One of the great geniuses of photography is that it can transmit over time and over space imagery that may be unavailable in other means, particularly at this time, obviously well before computers and actually before moving pictures were widely dispersed. The West was fascinated by China, and which is why so many of these photographs in this collection came from outside China. They had been taken home as souvenirs to amaze family and friends in the West. Now, this picture is different. This picture was taken by one of the great men of China, Li Hongzhang, and it is a dramatic picture showing a powerful man taken by a Chinese photographer, one of the better known men in China. And Lang Shitai was best known for photographing people in the higher end of Chinese society at one time. So you see between the last picture of a portrait and this one that we covered everything in the culture and people of China were photographed and are represented in our collection.
Yeah, I mean, would you say that your collection has any major gaps at all? I mean, we so far have seen a huge range of work.
No, in the historical range that we intended to document, which is the beginning of paper photography in the 1850s till about 1920, when changes began in China. We have a very comprehensive collection. Now, we're still buying things when we find great images, but I think we have excellent representation of every known important Chinese photographer. Not to saying that there won't be another one discovered from the 19th century, hopefully, but of those that are known, we have very good coverage. And also of the Western photographers, we have an extensive collection of great pictures. So I think that we have the capacity to put on a very broad demonstration of Chinese imagery, which is almost unmatched.
Yes, and it performs another important role, both at the time that these images were produced and also the collection as it stands now, as a form of de-exoticization. You know, this idea of exoticizing and sort of, you know, that fashionable academic word, othering, you know, putting something as being somehow not like us. When you see the photographs, it's just, okay, it's as it seems, you know, you get a sense that you're inside something without that veneer of the exotic. You know, even though we have an elite man here, you could recognize his rank badge and so on, and the type of, you know, Qing dynasty traditional costume, but there's something so real and immediate about the people that appear in these photographs, and actually nothing more so than these incredible costumes here by Lai Feng's his photographic work of the actors here. This work is extraordinary. Is it a rare work, this one, to show the actors in this way?
rare is a relative term. It is infrequently seen in this condition, where you can really see the detail and the quality of the photograph. So how many exist, we don't know. We really don't know, but it's not frequently seen. Now, one of the other things in the collection is a notebook, a large notebook of photographs of the Peking opera, which is one of the great artistic genres of China. And unfortunately, very little documentation of it from the late 19th century has been preserved. In fact, we've been unable to trace a similar book to the one we have, which shows scores and scores of photographs of the opera, the famous people who practiced it, and this brought it to mind, the costumes that they wore, which is a very important, I mean, in New York City, we have a museum of the opera, which is devoted to this kind of thing. And this book of pictures is something that alone deserves an exhibition in China at some time. So these costumes are costumes, but they represent high culture at a moment.
Yes, I mean, I've just noticed that, you know, people are saying the world, he's man-spreading, isn't he? The way his pose, he's sitting like you, that men sit on the underground trains here. It's an extraordinarily human work, you know, this.
And to relate this to something you asked before about, Lai Feng is one of the great early photographers. He learned very early on and started a dynasty that went on and on and on with his family and photographed every kind of photograph throughout China, and really was one of the best and most successful early photographers, both from an artistic and commercial standpoint. So when you see from one of the early periods, and his family goes way down, I think the grandchildren?
No, the son.
The son extended this company, taking pictures that really are very wonderful and last a long time.
Yeah, a dynastic sort of setup. And I mean, you know, he wasn't just portraits. Obviously, we've got in this case the south gate of the city.
Everywhere he went. Here you see the gate of Beijing, but he traveled throughout the country and took pictures in many places.
Recording his own region. And I find this fascinating. So we have here a hand-tinted Albumin print. This, again, is relatively, how often might you come across something that's been hand-tinted in this way? And what was the market that this kind of photograph was being aimed at?
Well, William Saunders actually brought the tradition of hand coloring photographs to China, but there were scores of painters in China who moved from painting traditional Chinese painting and also export Chinese painting and became very adept at hand coloring photographs for the market. Saunders relied for a great extent on the export market, people who came and bought his work, which tried to show the various occupations in China to a great extent. And his work is quite famous. The hand coloring is wonderful, but it quickly spread. And we have many great Chinese painted photographs of every genre because it tied in so closely to the great tradition of Chinese paintings. And in many cases it can be documented that the photographers worked in buildings or next door to traditional painters who found a new extension of their abilities into coloring this newfangled photography. So it's a wonderful extension of a traditional Chinese art and rapidly adopted by Chinese photographers as well.
Yeah, and actually, interesting enough, when you mention about documenting the different kinds of occupation, that's going very much into the Western importing industry of occupations of faraway lands, and sort of that tradition that's there in Western figurative art to show those occupations and to show these groups of people dressed in a certain way. You know, you really see that true exchange there. And I believe Saunders spent, you know, a good 20 years actually living and working in Shanghai. So I mean, he really lived amongst the place, like the sort of traders historically going back to 1600, and actually staying there for many years at a time.
Yes, he was well known and had a thriving business. This is very good. This is a wonderful photograph of A-Chan's studio, and my associate Stacey, who will talk a little later, has worked with people. We've had this translated, which is actually on the, as you look at it, the right side is apparently an announcement of the A-Chan studio. And what's interesting here is, using modern technology, we can look at the signs deep in the background, bring them out, and we can learn what existed in Heavenly Peace Street 150 years and more ago, which is extremely interesting. And that technique of digitalization and expansion of photographs allow us to do amazing things, which is another hidden value for study and learning in these old photographs, because we can pull off from the Shanghai Bund, for example, we can pull things off the signs along the Bund and show who was trading, what were the businesses, and sometimes the family name who was running them from the windows. And this is an area that really hasn't been applied to historic photography nearly as much as it has to be in the years to come. And we have pictures that really will tell us a lot about China.
Yes, and I mean, the fact that it's Guangzhou, so, you know, referred to into the West as Canton, as you see written on the lower left of the photograph. But, you know, it's also connecting that history of Guangzhou as the center of the trade with the West, all over European East India companies that you sort of learn about up to the 18th century. And then, of course, that enormous trade through the 19th century. And again, it's about bringing it to life and showing these real places. And I mean, really, this work here, I've seen many paintings of bridges. I've worked with an artist recently called Yang Mingyi, who is a Suzhou based artist who obsessively paints, amongst other things, the bridges of Suzhou. And you see these vertiginous curved bridges here, and sort of think it almost seems impossible, this sweep of the bridge. And then you see a photograph and realize that it's no exaggeration through painting, that this is exactly how it looks. So Thomas Child here, I believe he was an engineer, and again, this special interest.
He was a petroleum engineer, actually, who came to China on business, but had the technical ability to both see and record architecture, and did it beautifully. We saw one of the Great Wall, now we see one of the Jade Belt Bridge. And what you really have here is a very, very Chinese traditional symbol brought into the present by a Western photographer, which is the reason that my collection holds both Chinese and Western photographers, is to make sure that we preserve the largest scope possible of imagery of China, both from the Chinese perspective and also in the early days when the Westerners were first coming in with the technology. Because many things are destroyed, many things have been lost. Cities have changed, just like New York has changed.
Yeah.
There are very parts of New York but here in China, not so many of the photographs were preserved. And it's wonderful to have this ancient tradition available to future generations for study and aesthetic appreciation.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's been a huge privilege to be able to see, just scrape the surface of this collection that you've built up over the years, Stephen. And I want to go, thank you very much for your time and for explaining so clearly the importance of this collection and what role it has in terms of his history, aesthetic appreciation, but also the conservation of a culture that has to some extent disappeared but is being re-embraced. And I'd like to go now to Stacey's the film that she's made for us. And this really puts a different perspective on what we've been looking at. And Stacey, I'm going to share the screen now with the film that you've put together for us.
Okay, thank you.
Today I'm excited to share with you some rare Chinese landscape photographs from the Lowenthal Collection, taken by pioneering Chinese photographers. These works, by Lai Feng in the A Feng Studio, Tung Studio, Pao Qi Studio, and others, including yet to be identified Chinese artists, are some of the earliest photographs of the Chinese landscape. All of the historical photographs you will see were captured from the 1860s to the 1880s, while photography was still a new technology. It is critical to note that despite the artistic accomplishments achieved by the earliest Chinese photographers, 19th century photographers of China do not receive the recognition they deserve for their contribution to the history of photography. Institutions all over the world have exhibited the works of pioneering American and European photographers, such as Carleton Watkins and Gustave Le Gray. Works by these Western artists have been shown internationally, appearing in photography exhibitions in the world's greatest museums. But Chinese photographers remain largely unknown due to the scarcity of fine photographs from the period. Mr. Lowentheil generously shares his knowledge and passion for the history of photography in China through public exhibitions of important works from the collection and through symposiums like this one. Tsinghua University Art Museum in Beijing held its inaugural photography exhibition drawing exclusively from Mr. Lowenthal's collection. It was the first exhibition of its kind showing great masterpieces of photographic art made in China. Never before had works by artists such as Pao Qi Studio, Pun Lun Studio, and Tung Studio been exhibited in China. In addition, prior to the global pandemic, the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University presented the first solo exhibition of works by Lai Feng, considered one of the most accomplished late Qing Dynasty photographers. This exhibition drew primarily from the Lowenthal Collection and included works from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the J. Paul Getty Museum. The Lowenthal Collection includes the largest number of identified photographs by Lai Feng in the A Feng Studio. There are more than 600 identified photographs by Lai Feng in the A Feng Studio and the Lowenthal Collection of many thousands of photographs. It is through these types of public exhibitions that important early Chinese photographers will be recognized and acknowledged. We are excited that the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem will be presenting China Through the Lens in the fall of 2022. The Lowenthal Collection is planning a virtual exhibition of works of art by early Chinese photographers. Please be in contact and we will notify you when the virtual exhibition launches. The Lowenthal Collection includes photographs of the Chinese landscape in the finest condition, preserving the origins of art photography in China. Landscape photography in China expresses a long artistic legacy closely tied to traditional Chinese art and painting. Capturing the first photographic views of the Chinese landscape often involved long and difficult travel on a boat or river raft and through rocky terrain and wilderness. Photographers made the journey with heavy, bulky cameras, numerous fragile glass plates, and volatile chemicals. Chinese artists managed to achieve remarkable results producing negatives despite the arduous circumstances of working with photographic chemistry in challenging and diverse climates. Creating a photograph in the late Qing dynasty was technically difficult. Though a basic machine captured the moment, artists orchestrated all aspects of the photograph's artistic and technical production. An original photograph is an artist's personal expression. To achieve success, artists formulated photographic chemicals to their own precise specifications and experimented with lenses, cameras, light conditions, and exposure times. The wet plate collodion process prevailed as the means of creating photographic negatives from the 1850s to the 1880s. The process produced sharply detailed images. A glass plate negative was evenly coated with sticky collodion on site at the location the photograph was made. It was then sensitized with silver nitrate in the dark just minutes before it was placed wet in the camera and then exposed and processed. The process required clean water and a nearby or portable darkroom. Occasionally, a photographer's darkroom tent or camera will appear in a photograph. Here is an example of that in a photograph by Lai Feng. Depending on weather conditions, the photographer had approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete the process. Because exposure times are long, anything moving before the camera appears as a blur on the negative. Photographers made their albumin silver prints from glass plate negatives by floating a pliable lightweight rag paper in a bath of chloride and freshly beaten egg whites, albumin. Once the paper dried, it was sensitized in silver nitrate and dried again before it was loaded into a printing frame and exposed through the negative to bright sunlight. Then the paper was rinsed, fixed in a bath of sodium thiosulfate, and rinsed again. Each photographic print is a distinct impression, its history beginning and reflecting a specific time and place in China. Chinese artists overcame challenging obstacles to convey the character of a particular time and place in late Qing Dynasty China. It is clear from surviving prints that Lai Feng, Tung Studio, and others were distinguished technicians, which aided them as they created works of art that transcend time. Their artistic decisions were in part dictated by China's physical environment. Light, climate, and weather conditions in China ruled many aspects of the artist's work, and those atmospheric conditions literally participate in the constitution of original photographs. Few archival records survive documenting the lives of the earliest Chinese photographers or the operations of their studios. What is known is drawn from newspapers, trade directories, and a few rare documented accounts recorded by visitors. China's tradition in optics predates the introduction of photographic technology from the West. It is recorded that over 2 millennia ago, a Chinese philosopher and his followers discussed theories of light and optics from observing the natural environment. Writings in the 11th century show that all the principles necessary for the camera obscura, a precursor to the camera, were known in China hundreds of years before the device appeared in the West. The earliest known report in China of the invention of photography appeared on the 14th of December, 1839 in the Canton Press, an English-language weekly newspaper circulated in southern China. The paper printed an extract from the English journal Athenaeum entitled Photogenic Drawing, which gave a detailed account of Henry Fox Talbot's new process. Soon after, in 1843, the amateur French daguerreotypist Jules Itier traveled on a commercial mission to China, in which he created the earliest surviving photographs of the country. Itier noted in his journals that Chinese people enthusiastically embraced photography. In the following years, as the daguerreotype gave way to the Albumin silver print, many Chinese artists working in China's port cities learned the evolving art of wet plate collodion photography. One of the most talented, ambitious, and productive of them was Lai Feng. Lai Feng created some of the most accomplished late Qing Dynasty photographs. His studio produced a vast visual repository of information on 19th century China, including a broad range of views of the Chinese landscape. Lai Feng and his employees traveled more widely on photographic expeditions through China than any other 19th century Chinese or Western photographic studio. The locations and subjects captured by the A Feng studio express Lai Feng's sensitivity as a Chinese artist and his ambition. He is one of the first Chinese artists to photograph the Chinese landscape. Little is known about Lai Feng's life. He was born in 1839. He arrived in Hong Kong after fleeing the Taiping Rebellion. In 1883, he became a naturalized British subject. A Feng Studio survived Lai Feng's death in 1890 and continued to prosper by selling prints, many from negatives made by the studio's founder and staff decades earlier. Lai Feng's son and daughter-in-law ran A Feng Studio until the 1940s. Thus, the studio that Lai Feng established operated for about 80 years. A Feng Studio was one of the most prosperous and longest-standing photography studios in China. Lai Feng's photographs of the Chinese landscape are breathtaking and important. As a Chinese artist, Lai Feng was one of the first to capture China's natural beauty with a lens and camera. This is a stunning panoramic landscape by Lai Feng. More than any other late Qing Dynasty photographer, Lai Feng favored the panoramic format, the photographic format most connected with his artistic lineage. It is similar to a hand scroll. In 1869, Lai Feng made the first known photographs of Fuzhou and surrounding areas. Artists from many dynasties traveled through the Wuyi Mountains and wilderness, leaving poetic inscriptions in stone. Lai Feng, recognizing the natural beauty of the environment, made the arduous trek from Hong Kong to Fuzhou and through the Wuyi Mountains. His photographs of the stunning cliff faces and legendary rock formations are some of Lai Feng's greatest artistic achievements. Foreign and Chinese photographers, including the famous Scottish photographer John Thomson, followed in Lai Feng's footsteps, creating a series of photographs from Fuzhou. Tung Studio's series of photographs are regarded by scholars as pinnacles of late Qing Dynasty landscape photography. The Tung Studio created artistic views of the magnificent landscape and legendary rock formations, revered for generations by leading Chinese poets and philosophers. The works express a traditional literati aesthetic long associated with the grand Chinese landscape portrayed. The exceptional series of landscape photographs are unmatched in their sensitivity, reflecting traditional landscape painting. Each view in Tung Studios' series is an unparalleled integral photograph. When seen together, the series forms an expansive and encompassing embrace of the region. The resulting photographic prints are objects of contemplation as well as enjoyment. An artist's direct involvement in the creation of photographs allows for the transmission of atmosphere and feeling that is passed through the photographer, the camera, and the chemicals and onto a thin sheet of paper. China's earliest landscape photographs are more than accurate historical records. They impart to distant viewers throughout the ages an experience of the moment captured. Surviving photographs by Chinese artists pass before the eyes and through the hands of early photographers. Immersed in the artistic traditions of China, Chinese artists created photographs distinct from their international competitors. The work reveals the influence of Chinese literati painting, which heightened their appeal to Chinese clientele. This photograph of a waterfall by Lai Feng is reminiscent of a Chinese art tradition. The arresting image, like the stunning views of the rock formations of the Wuyi Mountains, invites the viewer to contemplate humankind's place in the natural landscape. The waterfall is a large falls located in the Dinghao Mountain National Nature Reserve. The nature reserve is known as the Green Gem. It was established as the first nature reserve in China. For thousands of years, the waterfall has been revered as a sacred place. The landscape photographs you have seen today are masterpieces of early photographic art, distinct from but equal to the works of famous early European and American photographers, such as Gustave Le Gray in France and Carleton Watkins in America. Like Watkins, Andrew Russell, Edward Muybridge, and other early photographers of the American West, Chinese artists captured the majesty and power of their nation's natural landscape. Pioneering Chinese photographers created the earliest photographs of China's natural beauty. Lang Jingshan, a 20th century Chinese photographer who championed the recognition of art photography in China, asserted that photography was an international language. In 1978, he wrote, "Photography is a kind of international language. It can break down the barriers imposed by space and time, and communicate despite the differences in written or spoken languages. It is the best method to enhance mutual understanding, friendship, world peace, and international communion." Despite the passage of time, 19th century photographs provide an opportunity to see China through the lens of talented Chinese artists before the epochal transformations of the 20th century. The landscape photographs pioneering Chinese artists created convey the grand beauty of China's natural world 150 years ago. Some show us a natural environment that has disappeared, while others, like the Lai Feng waterfall, depict natural places preserved and protected by the government. Each original photograph embodies both artistic achievement and deep historical significance.
Stacey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
I wanted to thank Pablo Parlay, who is here, because he helped me a great deal putting the movie together. So.
That was absolutely wonderful. I'm constantly taken aback by the artistry of the natural landscape. It's just extraordinary how the paintings just are the landscape. It really brings that home, seeing those the earlier photographs. Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Pablo. I'd like to go now to Stephanie, who's been waiting very patiently, and I'll ask you to unmute now, please, Stephanie. And as a reminder, Stephanie is a curator and a specialist at the Peabody in the history of photography of China at the Peabody Essex Museum, and a curator and a PhD candidate. And she's now going to talk to us about some of her research. And I'm going to enable you to share your screen now, Stephanie. So I'm making you the host. And I'm going to
thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to find my PowerPoint, share. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay, great. Thank you guys. Thank you all so much. Stephen, Stacey, Viv, and all the organizers at LACA. This has been a wonderful lecture and I'm learning so much. And I swear we didn't really sort of talk too much about the contents, but like there's so much overlap between the things that we are talking about today. So I'm so excited to be able to share it with you. Today, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the legacy of landscape photography in early 20th century China, so picking up where Stacey left off. And this is really the kind of work that I've been doing for my dissertation. So I'm finally having an opportunity to share this, and I'd love to hear about your feedback. So thank you. So yeah, I want to build off of Stacey's presentations and think about how technology alongside shifts in social, political, and cultural landscapes have enabled new visions of the natural world. Stacey pulled up this slide. I didn't know she was going to pull up this slide, but this is exactly what I was also thinking about. Because it shows how difficult it was to make photography in the 19th century. As she showed, Lai Feng had a portable darkroom. He had assistants. He had needed expertise with chemicals. He needed cooperation with weather. It was a very, very difficult task. And this was something that I think it does not really get appreciated. So I'm glad that you called that out. And yet, photographers in the 19th century, like from left, the studio of Tung, then Lai Feng, and then John Thompson, they each developed their own distinct visions of the natural world, in this case, Fuzhou. And so here I should mention that the exhibition, which was formerly called China Through the Lens, is now Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China. And it's slated to open at the Peabody Essex Museum in fall 2022. In this exhibition, we're going to be thinking about the role photography played in shaping our impressions of China through the lens of the photographic encounter. So we're really structuring the exhibition as a series of conversations or meeting points. And competition and cooperation are going to be some of the main themes of the exhibition. We're really excited to be featuring this exchange between Lai Feng and Tung and Thompson as one of the highlights of the exhibition, which brings together three incredibly beautiful and rare bodies of work that are all centered on the landscapes of Fuzhou. And I'm excited to be thinking about how they are sharing ideas and styles and aesthetic influences, but also how there are specific differences as well. And so, as Stacey had mentioned, in particular, the work of Lai Feng and Tung, Lai Feng on the left, Tung studio on the right, they have a very distinctive approach to photography and landscape photography, which is integrating aesthetics from literati painting into their work. I love these photographs because they almost seem to be like portraits of these rock formations. They're laden with these ideas of the rock as holding energy. And they're also, they are embedded with these stories about the rocks, about the sort of local legends and lore. And so this is a very sort of distinct way of approaching landscape photography that I think is very particular to the Chinese photographers. By the 1920s, however, which is the era that I've been writing about, a different kind of landscape photography emerges. It's much more intimate in scale. It's much more tightly focused on details and waterways. Here we see the work of Chen Wenli, who is an amateur art photographer in Beijing and who published the first art photography book in 1924 called The Great Wind Anthology. We'll be looking at a little bit more of his works later, but I just wanted to bring this up because there is a sort of study of contrast between the work that Lai Feng and Tung are doing, which is grand and immense and monumental, and the stuff that's Chen Wenli is doing, which is much more intimate. Much of this audience for Chen Wenli's work was this burgeoning new class of amateur art photographers who are interested in developing a Chinese approach to art photography. So this is about 10 years before Lang Junsan, which Stacey mentioned it as well. A lot of this has to do with changes in technology. So here, by the turn of the century, photographers were no longer using wet plate collodion technology. They were thinking about or using dry plate technology, and then later film cameras. And they no longer required portable darkrooms. photography became faster, easier, and cheaper, allowing for a larger swath of the public to take up photography as a hobby, albeit one that was still cost intensive. So a whole new marketplace for photographic materials emerged. Here we see Ouyang Huiqiang, who is a photographer from the legendary Paoqi studio that Stacey and Stephen also mentioned. Paoqi was one of the longest running studios in Shanghai. And in the 1920s, they just started to adapt and also create new materials like this guidebook for the amateur photographers. And you can see also on the left, Ouyang Huiqiang modeling this idea of who the amateur art photographer was. All you needed was to take your camera out into the field and photograph. You don't need those sort of massive portable darkrooms anymore. So this is a new sort of generation of photographers. But there were also other social and cultural impetuses for this intimate mode of landscape photography. To go forward, you kind of have to go backwards. And so here we're looking at what you were talking about, the Northern Song landscapes. There are precedents in this, right? So in the Northern Song dynasty, for example, there's the monumental ink painting on the left, like Guoxi's early spring. And that was the norm. But at the end of the 11th century, there was a shift to a new kind of painting, which focused on the intimate scene or xiaojing, such as Guoxi's Old Trees Level Distance on the right. So this mode emerged that was much more in this hand scroll format. It was something that was to be given and gifted and enjoyed amongst friends. And it was, in this particular instance, a retirement gift. And so this is a new kind of painting that's emerging that was latent with these metaphors and motifs and act as something for contemplation. So this is a precedent from moving from this monumental to this intimate sort of mode of painting. So in the 1920s, I think something similar is happening with landscape photography. Chen Wenli's 1924 Great Wind Anthology was one of the first book projects to create in this intimate mode. And copies are extremely rare. I think only about 100 were made. And they were gifted and sold to friends who were affiliated with the Beijing Light Society, an amateur society at Peking University, which was a hotbed of intellectual and political movement at this time. Here, we're looking at a copy from the Reginald Johnston collection. Reginald Johnston was the private tutor for the last emperor, Puyi. And so this work signaled a new kind of photography that was distinctly marketed and was speaking to the elite of China. So we're going to just see a couple of the photographs. So each one of them, the photographs is prefaced by a title page. It starts with "The Great Wind Rises." And then we see a photograph, these are colotypes, of an atmospheric blur of Beijing during the dust storms. And so this is really about giving a sense, a deep sense of the place. I think this is something about the details where you're thinking about the blurs and the dust storms and trying to give you at a moment what this place feels like. Then what follows are these small vignettes. Each of the photographs has a title and a location. For example, here it says "Behind the Palace," the Ming Tombs. And here Chen seems to be focusing on the repetition of the balustrades. The light is hitting the stairs beautifully, and then it's highlighting these structures. So this is a very, very small look at a detail that seems to be overlooked, but he's sort of created a view of it that is trying to encapsulate this all in an intimate scene. And the text is also deliberately evocative. And so you see the title here is "An Autumn with Reeds and Light Smoke on a Cold Day." The works of the image are trying to be giving an immersive contemplative experience. Actually, when you look at this, you don't actually see that much of the landscape itself. But what he's trying to convey here is a mood, an idea. And I think that's something that's very distinctive about this photography in the 1920s. And this last photograph of this overview is, I think, showing what he's trying to do. The title for this one is "After Yunlin's Intimate View of Pine and Rock." And so he's actually referencing the Yuan Dynasty master, Nizan. And this is a conscious calling back of these Yuan Dynasty literati painting. There's an attempt to actually take these literati paintings and find their equivalents in the natural world. So thinking about these examples, I think what we can extend what Stacey and Stephen were talking about with regards to 19th century landscape photography into the 20th century, and see it as a really an amateur art practice that is developing an indigenous response to these ideas of the natural world and photography. It's a different way of depicting the natural world, which I think is developing at this time, and it's tied to the technology, but also the development of this new social world of amateurism and amateurs. Most of this work, I think, has also been underrepresented. It's mostly thought about in terms of pictorialism. It's mostly thought about in terms of references to Stieglitz, Steichen Strand, these guys. But in thinking about this, I think there are ways where we can look further and deeper and comparing it to the literati painting tradition and thinking about what the ideas of art were actually circulating around that time amongst Chinese photographers. So this is just a little bit about what I've been working on with regard to my dissertation, but this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I hope this is something that is useful and sort of lends an idea about how the legacy of landscape photography evolves. It's not a static tradition. It's actually something that is continuing onward, and we could definitely pull it into like the contemporary as well. But for now, I think I will stop there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You've raised a number of things here, but before I ask a question, I'd like to invite anyone else to ask at this point.
I would like to ask Stephan, is there somewhere in the world that you would are very keen to put on your next exhibition? Is there somewhere, some part of the world or some place in China you haven't yet had an exhibition that you would be keen to do so?
Well, I guess the answer is, in short, we'd like to bring these photographs to the most interested parties possible. I would have to leave it to a Chinese cultural expert to tell me where in China they feel it would be most appreciated. We'd love to have another show in China. We had a great experience in Beijing at Tsinghua. We were treated so well, and our hosts were just wonderful. And we had 40 or 50,000 people come to see the show. So the answer is, wherever in China they have the facilities, as Tsinghua did in a beautiful new museum, we need, appropriate facilities. That's one answer. And the second thing is, we haven't done a West Coast American show yet. And I'd like to bring this to the West Coast of America, where there's a wide, diverse population.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't mind doing a show in San Francisco or on the Upper West Coast. There's always fun to do something in New York, but we live here.
Yeah.
So those are the three spots that strike me as most interesting.
Okay, thank you for that. Good to know. Viv, back to you.
Yes, well, I was just thinking, come to London. I'd love to have an opportunity to see these things. Well, Stephanie, I have a question for you, and it was just something you said at the end, actually, that I want to know more about, a particular interest. Well, you talk about the Yuan Dynasty paintings and that literati tradition there, and how you seeing that emerge, this evocative sense that's so reminiscent of that particular period. So why do you think the 1920s, why do you think, is it a political, a cultural change, that there is this, with the rise of amateurism, it suggests, A, that it's a sort of populist movement to try and sort of reclaim that literary tradition, but why then? What are your feelings about the reasons?
That's a really good question. And that is actually, I think, the crux of why then is the crux of the dissertation. I think it's a very it's a time of turmoil. It is right after the May 4th movement. So there's this huge move by a lot of these movers and shakers to kind of be very anti-Confucian. And so it's very much like trying to take, just sort of jettison the past and move on to a modern new world. But I think within that, I think there was that sort of move, but then there was a sort of reaction in terms of like, well, does that really mean that we have to jettison everything? And so there's like, I think a lot of these photographers and artists and intellectuals that are surrounding Peking University, which is where 1921 is where communism starts to develop in the university there. They're really reckoning with what to do about the future of the country. And so at that point, thinking about what that future entails, I think a lot of people do turn to the past. And so at that point, some of these photographers were searching. There were a lot of also art historians who were searching and looking at Song and Yuan dynasty paintings to sort of articulate what an idea of fine art for China in the 20th century would mean. And so I think that sort of infuses a lot of these art photographers as they're sort of, they are no longer literati. There's no longer any sort of civil service examination, but they are in this new competitive world where they're sort of trying to figure out what is our identity. And I think that sort of moves forward from there. They are taking these ideas from the past and starting to use them in their own artwork. And so I think a lot of it's social and political.
You think it's, yes, I mean, it makes a lot of sense how you've just explained it. And it's, it's also made me think of, if you think, here in the Royal Academy, I think it was 1936, anyway, mid-30s, there was the big exhibition that was about looking back, and it was objects selected by Sir Percival David and his counterpart in the museum that he was collaborating with, to bring these really parts of ancient Chinese culture as being somehow essential. There's an essentialism there, and it just makes me wonder whether this sort of spread of interest as well, whether the expansion of the amateur market also marks a broadening of interest in the history of China, beyond China as well, whether that's all part of a zeitgeist of a type, or whether, as you say, that response to the May the 4th movement, you've got the Sino-Japanese War, you've got your Communist Party and so on, such social upheaval that sort of safety in the refuge of the past, where it can't reach out and bite you, whether it is that sort of socio-psychological response that is symptomatic of particular times of political and cultural crisis.
I think it is that. I think it also is the technology. I mean, I think that photography allows you to see the past in some ways. And so at that moment, like photography, you could see photographs of reproductions of paintings, photographs of bronzes and antiques. These were being published for the first time. And so just people had a lot more access because of photography to these visual media that if you were in the Qing dynasty, you probably would never have seen these collections. And so I think that actually really makes an important change, giving people access to these ideas and these objects. And so I think, like the 19th century, it was feeding this idea of like, how do you know a faraway place? Like you can see it through the photographs.
Yes, yeah. And do you think there was any nostalgia? I mean, the fact that the Qing dynasty had fallen, Puyi was, just growing up as an ordinary citizen. Do you think there's any kind of sense of nostalgia going on as well, looking back in that way because of this very cataclysmic change socially?
I think in some ways, I think it is a nostalgia. I think that's a good word for it. I think there is a sense of, but it's a complicated nostalgia because it's like they don't want to go back to the past, but at the same time, well, what is the future? And so it's searching to try to figure out, well, what is the best way forward? And so it's a complicated nostalgia in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah. A fascinating project. I can't wait to read the thesis when you're ready to publish.
Thank
So,
you.
any other questions from anyone about the collection, or shall I wrap it up there?
I think if you've listened to those discussions, I don't think you'll ever look at a photograph in the same light again. Because of course, the first image of that beautiful temple in the sky, or it's a correct name eludes me, you suddenly think, well, where did he put the tripod? And it's something that you're not even thinking about beforehand. You take so much for granted today when you look at, underwater photographs of people swimming with whales. You've no idea. And so it was really interesting. And I want to thank everybody, because you've really, as Viv said earlier, you've really opened up and continue to open up questions. And what I absolutely adore about photography with an art history interest is that you notice the shoes, and you notice the very similar stance of people in the 1860s, as Viv said. The woman in the portraiture, she was standing on both the side of her feet because obviously her shoes were hurting. Well, we still do it. I mean, it's very real, and it brings you into a completely different era in a very real way. And I think that's something that perhaps possibly not only as a historical document, but it's a kind of emotional experience in a way, because it very much puts you in that time and in that room with the photographer. And that little person looking at you, as Stephan said, was totally engaging with the photographer, and probably the bang or the flash that came about. So it's fantastic, and thank you all, because this is what the LACA education program wants to do. It wants to expose people to things and make them think in a way that they may not do ordinarily. And on that note, I will now keep quiet.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. I sometimes say Stephen, I sometimes say Stephan. It's so unpredictable. And Stacey and Stephanie, Virginia, for enabling this to happen, and me, I've been down on the screen as Virginia. Of course, I'm using the Zoom license here. Me, Viv Laws. Thank you very much, and also to Pablo for making that wonderful film for us. Really enjoyed it. I'm going to stop recording now, and then we can. There we are. Okay. Okay. I think Stephanie, you probably need to give me back control of the screen. I'm not able to stop. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'd forgotten as well.
Here you go.
Thank you very much. So we should have this available very soon for anyone who wants to sort of catch up on this, and it'll remain on the LACA site. It will remain on the Lowenthal site, and accessible through the courthold. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you so much. And
Thank you for
Thank you.
I mean, really, and